This is the largest thing I've ever sculpted, and molding it was pretty intimidating. I don't have a lot of mold making experience, and the stuff that I have made, something's always gone wrong. I didn't want to waste all of the time that I'd spent sculpting and all of the money on the materials that you would need for a mold like this just to have it go wrong. So I messaged one of my FX friends here in Perth called Rich and asked him if he would help, and he said yes. He was amazingly generous with his time and his knowledge, and it just made the whole process go so much smoother. So I wouldn't recommend trying to follow this tutorial if you don't have mold making experience, as I would hate for it to fail and for you to waste a lot of time and money on it. So originally we were planning on making this as a one-part mold because the sculpt sat on the head in a way that there wouldn't be any undercuts. An undercut is a part of the sculpt which usually curves under in a way that pouring a liquid molding material into it would wrap around it, and then when it became solid it would be locked in and you wouldn't be able to separate those two halves. They can be as large as an obvious curve under the chin or under the nose, or they can be as subtle as a cheekbone. That weighs a lot. So behind the ears, where the ears go back, was going to be a lock area, so we positioned the clay in front of it, we positioned the clay wall down in front of the chin, so it looked like we could have these two pieces that would fit back together and wouldn't lock. So the first step was building this clay wall, and so it serves the purpose of avoiding the undercut areas, and it also creates the structure of the mold. So whatever you build the wall onto, you're going to create the mold on top of that. And this acts as what will be the smooth edge of your mold. So it's good to get it as smooth and as straight as possible. You can either use a board or that clay cutting wire to get a nice solid straight slabs of clay. I'm using water-based wet clay for this. I had to put support structures under it to keep it up under the weight of the ultracal 30, which is what we're going to make the mold out of. I then sprayed the sculpt with a few layers of crystal clear, which just seals the surface and makes it a bit easier to demold it. And I put Vaseline over all the exposed plaster so that the ultracal wouldn't bond with it. So we're doing this process and Dan comes over. Dan's another experienced mold maker using this studio, and Dan suggested that making this into a two-part mold would be way easier for cleaning the clay out of it. So if you look at the structure of the sculpture and the way that these big clumps of clay are curving backwards, it would be nearly impossible to get my hand and my sculpting tools into the mold to clean it out before running it. I'll do a little drawing to explain it, but basically it would have taken weeks to try and clean it out. So we decided to turn it into a two-part mold, which means that instead of it just being like, one part into one part, the two parts of the mold are going to split down the center. The easiest way for us to do this would be to split it down where the natural split happens in the sculpt, down the lip area, and just continue it up the center of the sculpt. So we turned the sculpt on its side, we put it onto a pillar and just made sure we didn't put much pressure down onto it because you don't want to distort or completely mess up the sculpt on the other side. And then we built that dividing wall down the center of the sculpt out of wet clay again. We also put like a thinner slab of wet clay on top of those dividing walls, and this will form a lip that will stop the ultracal just from running off and creating a mess. And that piece of clay actually also helps to keep the sculpts so when you're sculpting it, that lip is going to not have the ultracal, and then it means that both sides of the mold are going to have like a half an inch gap between each side, and so if those two pieces aren't directly touching, if there's a little bit of a gap there, it means it's easier to get in screwdrivers and things like that to split the molds apart, so it's actually really helpful. We also put in keys, and so you just use a circular object to get like a little circle indent on one side, and then when you pour the clay into it, it's going to fill that space, and then when you make the mold on the other side, it's going to be inverted, so it kind of interlocks like a puzzle piece, and this means that your two halves are always going to go back exactly in the right place, locking in with those keys. And we also put in pry points. So these are just small little rectangles on the very edge of the mold, and we keep them in for both sides of the sculpting, and then you take them out at the end, so there's going to be a little hole that you can put screwdrivers and things in that goes into the mold, so you can use that to pry open the mold, which is why it's called a pry point. The material that we're going to be using to make this mold is called ultracal 30, so it's a gypsum stone mold. For a comparison, it ends up being much stronger and much harder than plaster. We ended up using 15 kilograms of this, if I remember correctly. It's a good material for making molds, as it's one of the cheaper materials. It's pretty strong, and it's really good for running latex, as it's porous enough that it will absorb some of the moisture from the latex and help the latex to dry from within the mold. So the product will come with an MSDS sheet and information on how you mix it and the quantities and all that. So I was wearing a dust mask, I was wearing safety glasses, and I was wearing gloves while mixing this. Instead of a bucket of water, I think it was like that much, and then we added the ultracal 30 just in like a big pile until it formed an island because it wasn't being absorbed by the water anymore. And then I started mixing it with my hand with the gloves on so you can feel all the lumps. it will start the chemical process when you start mixing it. It starts out pretty thin and then it starts thickening up until you can no longer use it anymore. And then as it sets, I think it goes through 2 different thermal reactions where it will get actually quite hot and then cool down and get hot again and then cool down, and then it's usually set after that. The first layer you start painting while it's still quite thin. We used a chip brush to get it into all of the details. Don't push so hard so that you get brush imprints on your sculpt though. So we build up this first layer. As it gets thicker and thicker, you're just gonna put more and more on until it stops sliding off. And then when it's no longer running off, we grab some fiberglass sheeting and we put the fiberglass over the mold to reinforce it and give it some strength, and then put the rest of the ultracal on top. So usually people use burlap fabric in ultracal molds, but I was told that for the larger molds that fiberglass sheeting works a little bit better. And fiberglass has its own safety aspects that need to be considered, so I just left it to the professionals to properly prepare and cut up all the fiberglass for it. And the ultracal ended up setting really fast towards the end. We didn't end up getting enough of the last layer on, so we mixed up another batch that we made thicker, and then we put this on top, smoothing it all out. It's a lot easier to clean up the mold while the ultracal is still setting. So if you want straight objects around the clay walls and stuff to clean it up, and use your hands just to smooth out the surface of it all, it's just so much easier cleaning it up before it's a really hard stone. Once that side had properly set, we flipped it over. I removed that clay dividing wall between the 2 pieces and then put some Vaseline over it so that the 2 halves wouldn't fuse together. And then we built up another little retaining wall just to keep the liquid in. And you can see here how the keys and the pry points made it into that ultracal side. We repeated the same process on this side of adding like a thinner detail coat first, waiting for it to thicken, then adding the fiberglass sheeting over it, and then finishing it with a last layer of ultracal 30. So we decided to open the mold while it was still warm, as the heat from the chemical process will have melted the clay a little bit, and it'll just make it so much easier to open it while the clay is soft and elastic, and we can get out most of that clay while it's in that state. So we got the majority of the clay out that night. I think I spent an hour cleaning it out, and then I spent the rest of the next day trying to get out the tiny bits of clay from the really deep recesses. And this is in 2 parts. It was still really difficult. It took me a long time. I couldn't even imagine trying to do that in 1 part, so I'm really glad that we split the mold in half. And you will want to use wooden tools while cleaning out your sculpt, as the metal tools could scratch your mold. Once I'd gotten the majority of the clay out, I went in with some low odor terps, and I was using gloves, and I was using eye protection, and I made sure I had a lot of ventilation, as the terps fumes are also pretty gross. And then I used a toothbrush with the terps just to get out any little residual bits of clay in there, and then I rinsed out the whole mold with warm water and some soap just to get it really clean. So that is the molding process. The casting process will be linked here when that is uploaded. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this, and I will see you soon. Bye.